the realization that he might actually say no dawned upon me. So I thought if I ask Kate first, then he can't really say no. So I did that way around and managed to speak to Mike sort of soon after it happened, really.
The palace tried to silence him, but on January the 15th, Prince William did the unthinkable. With trembling hands and tears in his eyes, he revealed what's really been happening to Prince George and Prince Louis behind closed doors. What he said next left the world speechless. The royal family will never be the same. Palace insiders are in complete panic, and when you hear what's been done to these innocent children, you'll understand why William finally snapped.
In this, with the great diversity of our communities, we can find the strength to ensure that right triumphs over wrong.
By mid-morning, reporters had gathered outside the palace gates. There had been whispers for weeks, speculation in the tabloids, but no one truly knew what was coming. The palace had only confirmed that Prince William would be making a personal statement, and that single word, personal, was enough to send ripples through the media. When William finally appeared before the cameras, his face was pale and drawn. His usual composure seemed fragile, as though he was holding himself together by sheer will alone. His opening words were quiet but deliberate. He spoke about his sons, Prince George and Prince Louis, and how deeply they had been affected by recent events. He didn't go into extensive detail, but the emotion in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't a rehearsed palace speech, it was a man speaking from a place of genuine pain, asking for understanding and privacy for his children. Within minutes, the statement had been broadcast across Britain and around the world. News outlets scrambled to analyze every word, every pause, every flicker of emotion on his face. To understand how things reached this point, you have to go back a few weeks. In early November 2025, the Wales family was navigating an incredibly difficult period. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been undergoing medical treatment for several months, and while the palace had released limited information, the strain on the family was becoming increasingly apparent. William had been balancing his royal duties with his responsibilities at home, but those close to him noted how tired he looked, how forced his smiles had become during public engagements. The real concern, however, centered on the children. Prince George, now 12 years old, had become noticeably withdrawn. Friends and teachers at Lambrook School reported that he seemed distracted, distant, and far less engaged than usual. He had always been a thoughtful child, perhaps aware from an early age of the weight that would one day rest on his shoulders, but this was different. George had started pulling away from activities he once enjoyed, avoiding social situations and spending long periods alone. Prince Louis, younger and typically full of energy, had changed too. The boy who used to charm crowds at royal events with his playful antics had grown unusually quiet. He no longer seemed comfortable in public settings and had begun asking questions that worried his parents deeply. According to people familiar with the situation, Louis had started expressing fears about loss, about his mother's health, about whether their family would stay together. For a child so young, these were heavy burdens to carry. Life at Adelaide Cottage, the family's home on the Windsor estate, had become increasingly tense. The usual sounds of childhood, laughter, and games and afternoon chaos had been replaced by a kind of careful quiet. William and Catherine did everything they could to maintain normalcy, but the pressure was mounting from all sides. Medical appointments, public scrutiny, and the constant presence of security and staff made it nearly impossible for the family to simply be together without the weight of their position hanging over them. Then came the incident that would prove to be a turning point. During a school assembly at Lambrook, Prince George reportedly became visibly upset after another student made a comment about his mother's illness. The details of exactly what was said remain private, but George left the assembly in tears. School staff handled the situation discreetly, and it was never supposed to become public knowledge, but somehow, word got out. A journalist overheard a conversation between staff members, and within hours, tabloids were running stories speculating about the emotional toll on the royal children. Headlines screamed about family crisis and childhood trauma, often with very little actual information to back up their claims. The palace tried to contain the story, but once it was out there, it took on a life of its own. Photographers began camping outside Adelaide Cottage again. Every school run became an opportunity for paparazzi to capture images of the children, looking for any sign of distress. For William, this was the breaking point. He had grown up under intense media scrutiny. He remembered what it was like to have his childhood dissected by tabloids, to see his mother pursued by photographers, to feel like his private pain was entertainment for the masses. He had promised himself that his own children would have a different experience, but now he was watching history repeat itself. The situation escalated when a confidential palace memo was leaked to the press. The document, which was meant only for senior royal staff, discussed reducing Prince Louis's public appearances due to what was described as increasing emotional sensitivity. The leak was devastating on multiple levels. First, it exposed private discussions about the well-being of a child. Second, it suggested that the palace was more concerned with managing appearances than with actually addressing the underlying issues. And third, it gave the media even more material to work with. News outlets ran wild with the story. Some accused the palace of hiding something serious. Others criticized William and Catherine's parenting, suggesting they weren't doing enough to prepare their children for royal life. American media, always interested in the British monarchy, picked up the story and ran segments comparing the situation to Princess Diana's struggles with the press. The parallels were uncomfortable and, for William, deeply personal. Inside the palace, advisors urged caution and silence. The traditional approach was to say nothing, let the storm pass, and wait for public attention to move elsewhere. But William was no longer willing to follow that script. He had watched his mother suffer under the weight of palace protocol and had seen how the institution's obsession with image over reality had caused real damage. He wasn't going to let the same thing happen to his sons. He began pushing back against his own communications team, demanding they take stronger action to protect the children's privacy. But the palace machinery moved slowly, bound by tradition and concerned primarily with maintaining the monarchy's carefully crafted image. For William, the frustration was overwhelming. These weren't abstract problems or matters of state. These were his children, and they were hurting. The tension reached its peak when William found Prince Louis hiding one evening, quietly crying while news programs debated his mother's health on television. The little boy looked up at his father and asked him to make it stop. That moment crystallized everything for William. All the royal protocols, all the careful media management, all the concern about how things would look. None of it mattered if his sons were suffering in silence. That's when he made his decision. He would speak out publicly, not through carefully worded palace statements, but in his own voice, as a father. It was unprecedented. Future kings don't break protocol. They don't publicly acknowledge family struggles. They certainly don't criticize, even implicitly, the very institution they will one day lead. But William had reached a point where protecting his children mattered more than protecting tradition. The changes in Prince George and Prince Louis didn't happen overnight. They were gradual, the kind of shifts that might go unnoticed by strangers but were painfully obvious to their parents. George, who had always shown a thoughtful curiosity about royal history and his future role, began to retreat inward. He stopped asking questions about state occasions or expressing interest in accompanying his father to charity events. Instead, he spent hours alone in his room or sitting by the windows at Adelaide Cottage, often sketching in a notebook he kept close. Catherine noticed that the drawings were nearly always the same. Two small figures holding hands beneath a tree, sometimes with a third figure nearby. When she gently asked George about his artwork, he simply said he was drawing a family that got to stay together. The response, delivered so matter-of-factly by a 12-year-old boy, broke her heart. It revealed just how deeply the uncertainty and tension had burrowed into his young mind, creating fears he couldn't fully articulate but expressed through his art. Prince Louis, typically the most spirited of the Wales, children underwent an equally troubling transformation. His infectious laughter, which had always echoed through the cottage halls, became rare. The little boy who used to delight in royal events, sometimes stealing the show with his animated reactions, now shrank from cameras. He refused to wear the formal outfits laid out for him, and during one scheduled photo session, he tugged at his collar and whispered that he didn't want to be a prince that day. Catherine heard him and felt a chill run through her. It was an innocent statement from a child, but it spoke to something much deeper, a desire to escape the weight of expectation that was already pressing down on such small shoulders. The palace staff tried their best to maintain routines and provide normalcy, but the atmosphere had shifted. Nannies and security personnel moved more quietly through the house. Even the usually light-hearted moments like afternoon tea or bedtime stories felt strained. William noticed that his sons Longa ran to greet him when he returned from engagements. They were polite and well-mannered, but there was a distance there that hadn't existed before. Then the leaked memo became public and everything got worse. The document appeared on a tabloid website late one evening, marked as confidential and intended only for senior palace advisors. It outlined concerns about Prince Louis's emotional state and suggested that reducing his public appearances might be necessary for his well-being. The memo used clinical language, discussing the young prince as though he were a public relations problem to be managed rather than a child who needed support. The reaction was swift and brutal. By the next morning, newspapers across Britain had turned the story into front-page news. Headlines ranged from sympathetic to accusatory. Some outlets expressed concern for the children's well-being, while others questioned whether William and Catherine were equipped to handle the pressures of raising future royals. American media jumped on the story as well, with morning shows discussing the situation and drawing comparisons to the late Princess Diana's own struggles with royal life and media intrusion. For William, the leak represented a fundamental betrayal. Someone within the palace, someone with access to confidential discussions about his family, had chosen to share that information with the press. He demanded to know who was responsible, but palace aides were evasive. The communications team, more concerned with damage control than accountability, advised him to stay silent and let the story fade naturally. They assured him that public attention would eventually shift to something else, that the best strategy was always to wait it out. But William knew better. He had seen this pattern before, watched how the press fed on royal vulnerability and turned private pain into public spectacle. Once the media sensed weakness or detected a crack in the carefully maintained facade, they never stopped digging. The feeding frenzy would only intensify unless someone took action to stop it. During this particularly difficult period, Princess Anne made an unexpected visit to Windsor. She found William pacing in the garden near the rose beds that his mother had once tended. Anne, known throughout the royal family for her direct manner and practical approach, didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, she told him plainly that he couldn't win a war against the press, but he could protect his children. She had lived through decades of media scrutiny herself and understood the toll it took, particularly on young people who never asked for the attention. Anne proposed a solution that was characteristic of her no-nonsense style. Bring the boys to her estate at Gatcombe Park for a while. Away from Windsor, away from the cameras and the constant presence of palace staff, they could simply be children. The estate was secluded, far from the usual royal spotlight, and Anne insisted that what George and Louis needed most wasn't sympathy or careful handling, but the chance to experience normal life, even if just temporarily. Within days, the arrangement was made. George and Louis travelled to Gatcombe Park with minimal fanfare. There were no nannies hovering nearby, no security teams visible at every turn, and no rigid schedules dictating their days. The first night was awkward for everyone. The boys were used to structure and routine, to a household that ran with clockwork precision. At Gatcombe, things were different. Anne put them to work immediately, insisting they help with daily chores around the estate. George learned to saddle horses, something he had done before, but never without several adults supervising his every move. At Gatcombe, Anne simply showed him how and then stepped back, letting him figure it out. Louis planted bulbs in the cold November soil, getting his hands dirty in a way that would have been discouraged back at Adelaide Cottage, where maintaining appearances was always a consideration. The rhythm of rural life, with its simple tasks and lack of ceremony, began to work its quiet magic on both boys. Anne's approach was deliberate. She didn't coddle them or treat them as fragile. She didn't constantly ask how they were feeling or try to draw out their emotions through conversation. Instead, she gave them meaningful work and allowed them to find their footing naturally. The physical labor, the fresh air, and the absence of constant scrutiny created space for the boys to breathe and to remember what it felt like to just exist without the weight of their titles pressing down on them. While George and Louis were healing in the countryside, the situation outside continued to spiral. In the United States, talk shows dedicated entire segments to discussing whether the Wales family could survive the pressure of royal life. Commentators debated whether William and Catherine's approach to parenting was too protective or not protective enough. Some praised their efforts to shield their children from excessive scrutiny, while others argued that royal children needed to be tougher and more prepared for public life. In an unexpected moment, Prince Harry publicly voiced his concern during an interview in California. He spoke carefully but clearly about how children shouldn't inherit pain, making it clear he was referring both to his own sons and to his brothers. It was a rare show of empathy between the two princes, whose relationship had been strained for years following Harry's departure from royal duties and his subsequent criticisms of the institution. For a brief moment, their shared experience of growing up under intense scrutiny seemed to bridge the distance between them. However, the moment of unity was complicated when Meghan published a blog post about healing and conscious parenting. While American audiences generally received it well, viewing it as compassionate and supportive, British media reacted with skepticism and criticism. Many commentators accused her of exploiting her brother-in-law's crisis for personal publicity, suggesting the timing was calculated to draw attention to her own brand. The response highlighted the deep divide in how Meghan was perceived on opposite sides of the Atlantic, with Americans often seeing her as a victim of British press cruelty, while British tabloids portrayed her as opportunistic and self-serving. Meanwhile, British media outlets were demanding transparency from the palace. If there's nothing seriously wrong, one prominent commentator challenged on air, then why all the secrecy? The question resonated with audiences who felt entitled to know about the lives of royals, particularly the direct heirs to the throne. That tension between the public's perceived right to information and a family's right to privacy had always existed around the monarchy, but it had reached a critical point with William's children. By mid-November, the situation at Windsor had become untenable. William walked into a meeting with senior palace staff and made an announcement that left the room in stunned silence. He told them directly that he was done hiding his children, that George and Louis were not pawns to be moved around for public relations purposes, and that the current approach would stop immediately. It was a declaration of independence from a future king who had always been seen as dutiful and compliant with palace protocol. The staff members present understood the significance of what they were witnessing. William wasn't just pushing back against specific decisions or questioning particular strategies. He was fundamentally challenging the way the institution operated, prioritizing his role as a father over his position as heir to the throne. It was the kind of defiance that his mother had shown decades earlier, but coming from William, the person who had always seemed most committed to preserving and protecting the monarchy, it carried greater weight. The very next day, palace officials received formal notice that Prince William would be making a personal statement on November 23rd. The communication hadn't been approved by the palace's media team and hadn't gone through the usual channels of review and revision. It didn't need to, because William had made his decision regardless of institutional approval. For the first time in modern royal history, a future king was preparing to step directly into the storm, not to shield the crown from criticism, but to shield his children from further harm. The days leading up to William's announcement felt heavy with anticipation. Windsor Castle, usually a place of measured routine and carefully choreographed public appearances, had transformed into something closer to a fortress under siege. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension as staff members moved through the corridors, speaking in hushed tones, aware that something unprecedented was about to happen, but uncertain of exactly what form it would take or what the consequences might be. Prince William had stopped consulting with his advisors in any meaningful way. The palace communications team made repeated attempts to convince him to issue a more traditional statement, something diplomatic and vague that would acknowledge public concern without revealing too much about the family's private struggles. They drafted several versions for his review, each carefully worded to protect the institution while appearing to address the situation. But William rejected them all. He had made up his mind that protecting appearances was no longer his priority. When one particularly persistent aide tried once more to change his approach, William responded simply that his sons were not shields for the monarchy, they were children who deserved better. Across the Atlantic Ocean, American media had already embraced the story with characteristic intensity. Morning television shows in New York and Los Angeles opened their broadcasts with segments about the young princes and the pressure they faced. The coverage was generally sympathetic, with hosts and commentators drawing parallels between William's situation and his mother's famous struggles with the royal institution. Princess Diana's legacy loomed large over the narrative, her fight for her son's well-being held up as a template for understanding William's current position. The comparisons were unavoidable and deeply personal for William, who had lived through his mother's battles and witnessed firsthand the cost of her defiance. Back at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine remained focused on maintaining stability for the children during this turbulent period. Each evening she read stories to George and Louis by candlelight, deliberately avoiding screens and the digital world that had become so invasive in their lives. There were no tablets, no television, no connection to the constant churn of news coverage and speculation. She was creating a small sanctuary within their home, a space where her sons could simply be children listening to stories rather than subjects of international media scrutiny. Sometimes, in quiet moments between pages, she would pause and brush away tears that the boys weren't supposed to see, especially when Louis asked in his small voice when the noise outside their lives would finally go away. At Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne continued her practical approach to helping the boys heal. She taught them simple but meaningful tasks that had nothing to do with royal protocol or public duty. George and Louis learned to groom horses properly, not as a photo opportunity, but as a genuine responsibility. They chopped wood for the fireplaces, collected eggs from the hen house, and stacked hay bales in the barn. These were ordinary activities that most children their age might take for granted, but for two young princes who had spent their entire lives surrounded by staff and structure, they were revolutionary. Anne's method was straightforward and effective. One morning, as she and George worked together moving hay, she told him directly that he didn't need to be a prince all the time, that sometimes it was enough to just be a boy who got dirty and tired from honest work. For the first time in weeks, George laughed, a genuine sound of relief and joy. But while healing progressed slowly in the Gloucestershire countryside, turmoil continued to build in the press. A senior journalist from The Times managed to obtain photographs of the boys during their time at Gatcombe Park. The images themselves were innocent, showing George and Louis riding horses with their great-aunt, clearly enjoying themselves in a relaxed environment. But the captions and accompanying articles transformed these wholesome moments into something more sinister. Headlines claimed the royal children were in hiding, with some outlets suggesting that William and Catherine were attempting to shield the boys as a way of protecting Kate's reputation or managing some deeper family crisis that hadn't been revealed to the public. William's patience, already worn thin by weeks of relentless media pressure, finally broke completely. He summoned his press secretary to Windsor and delivered an ultimatum. The palace had wanted a statement, and now they would get one, but it would be on his terms, in his words, coming from his heart rather than from a committee of advisors concerned primarily with institutional optics. He began drafting the words that would soon echo around the world, writing not as a future king, but as a father who had reached the end of his tolerance for watching his children suffer. During this same period, Prince Harry reached out from California with a private message that surprised many within palace circles. The communication was brief but significant, telling William that he understood what this moment felt like and urging him to protect his sons at all costs, to not let the palace machinery win. The message represented a rare moment of connection between the two brothers, whose relationship had been strained to the breaking point in recent years. Despite choosing very different paths and making very different decisions about their lives within or outside the royal family, they were bound together by shared memories of growing up under impossible scrutiny and watching their mother fight similar battles. Not everyone's response was as straightforward. Meghan, always aware of media opportunities and public perception, shared a carefully crafted post on social media about the healing power of transparency in parenting and motherhood. The message was subtle and could be read as supportive, but the timing was unmistakable. British tabloids erupted with accusations that she was exploiting William's family crisis to promote her own brand and maintain her relevance in the public conversation. American audiences generally saw her post as compassionate and appropriate, while British commentators called it tone-deaf and opportunistic. The stark difference in reactions highlighted the persistent divide in how Meghan was perceived across different cultures and media landscapes. At the same time, mental health advocates and child psychologists began speaking out in support of William's decision to address the situation publicly. A child psychologist who had reportedly provided consultation to the royal family told the BBC that for children living under extraordinary levels of scrutiny, the greatest gift a parent can offer is permission to be ordinary, to have struggles and fears without those experiences being turned into public spectacle. The expert's words resonated deeply with parents around the world who understood the challenge of raising children in an age of constant connectivity and social media exposure. The comment sections of news articles and social media posts are filled with stories from ordinary families dealing with their own versions of pressure, burnout, and the difficulty of protecting childhood innocence in the modern world. For the first time since the crisis began, the narrative started shifting away from royal scandal and toward a more universal conversation about what it means to raise children in the public eye. The discussion expanded beyond the specific circumstances of George and Louis to encompass broader questions about privacy, mental health, and the responsibilities of media outlets when covering young people who never chose to be famous. Parents from diverse backgrounds shared their own experiences of watching their children struggle under various forms of pressure and praised William for being willing to speak openly about challenges that many families face but few discuss publicly. Inside the palace walls, however, the institutional response remained deeply divided. Senior courtiers warned that William's planned statement could destabilize the monarchy by breaking centuries of precedent about how royals should conduct themselves in public. The traditional approach had always been to maintain dignity through silence, to never explain and never complain, as Queen Elizabeth had famously modelled throughout her long reign. But Princess Anne, never one to shy away from difficult conversations, stood firmly in William's corner. She told the worried advisors that the royal family's real problem had never been truth or honesty, but rather the institutional insistence on pretending that royals didn't experience normal human emotions and struggles. By November 22nd, the decision was irreversible. William would appear before cameras the following morning to deliver his statement. There would be no rehearsals, no teleprompter, no carefully staged setting designed to project a particular image. It would simply be him speaking from the heart, saying what needed to be said regardless of how the institution or the media or the public might respond. That night, Catherine kissed their sons goodnight and whispered to them that tomorrow their father was going to make things better. It was a promise made with hope rather than certainty, but it was what they needed to hear. When dawn broke on November the 23rd, Windsor was wrapped in a thick fog that seemed appropriate for the moment. Press photographers and television crews gathered outside the gates in the cold morning air, their cameras pointed toward the palace, waiting for something they couldn't quite anticipate. Inside, William stood alone for a moment, adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths to steady himself. He whispered quietly to himself that there would be no more silence, no more hiding behind protocol and institutional convention. Then he stepped forward to face the cameras and the world, and Britain prepared to witness something it hadn't seen in decades. A royal heir choosing to tear down the wall between duty and love, between public image and private truth. When Prince William appeared before the camera on the morning of November 23rd, the world seemed to hold its breath. There were no palace courtiers standing nearby to manage the message, no elaborate staging to project royal authority. Just a man in a simply furnished room at Windsor Castle, speaking words that came from somewhere deeper than protocol or tradition could reach. His hands trembled slightly as he began, a visible sign of the vulnerability he was choosing to display. He opened by stating clearly that he was speaking as a father, not as a representative of an institution or as the future king, but as a parent concerned for his children's well-being. The statement itself was brief. William explained that Prince George and Prince Louis were not public figures in the way adults in his position were, that they were children who deserved peace, privacy, and understanding from both the press and the public. He acknowledged that the past months had been difficult for his family and that while they continued to work through their challenges, he was asking for compassion and space to allow his sons to heal away from constant scrutiny. His voice carried a tremor of emotion that no amount of royal training could hide, revealing the depth of feeling behind each carefully chosen word. The impact was immediate and profound. Within seconds of the video's release, it began spreading across social media platforms faster than any official palace statement had ever traveled. News organizations interrupted their regular programming to broadcast William's words. Hashtags supporting the young princes trended worldwide within minutes. People in coffee shops and living rooms across Britain stopped their conversations to watch the clip on their phones, many visibly moved by the raw honesty they were witnessing. Even the BBC, typically measured and formal in its royal coverage, described the moment as defining for the modern monarchy. However, behind the scenes at Buckingham Palace, the reaction was far less unified. Senior palace officials, who had been kept largely in the dark about William's exact plans, scrambled to respond to a situation they hadn't approved and couldn't control. Palace aides rushed to draft a follow-up statement that would provide more official framing, something more formal and measured that would align with traditional royal communications. But by the time they released their carefully edited version, it was irrelevant. The world had already seen something genuine and unfiltered, and no amount of institutional spin could change the fact that William's personal words had connected with millions of people in a way official statements never could. American television networks played the clip repeatedly throughout the day, with commentators offering their analysis during every news cycle. Oprah Winfrey, speaking during a live broadcast segment, drew direct comparisons between William's statement and Princess Diana's famous acts of defiance against palace convention. She noted that this was the same courage Diana had shown when she spoke openly about the pain and isolation she experienced behind palace walls. The comment reignited conversations about Diana's legacy and her influence on her sons, particularly William, who had always seemed more reserved and more committed to traditional royal duties than his younger brother Harry. British newspapers responded with their typical mix of perspectives. The Guardian published a thoughtful piece describing William's statement as a fundamental break in the unwritten royal code about public displays of emotion and family vulnerability. The Daily Mail took a more critical stance, with some columnists expressing concern that William was exposing the Crown's private struggles in ways that could undermine the monarchy's mystique and authority. Opinion pieces debated whether his honesty was brave or reckless, whether it showed strength or weakness, whether it would ultimately help or harm the institution he would one day lead. Then came the response from California, and with it, fresh controversy. Meghan Markle posted a brief message on social media expressing support for any parent facing the impossible choice between duty and love. The words themselves were gentle and could be interpreted as genuinely supportive, but many British commentators immediately questioned her motives. Tabloid columnists accused her of making the situation about herself, suggesting she was using William's family crisis as an opportunity to remain relevant in the ongoing narrative about the royal family. Some speculated that she might incorporate the themes into her next podcast season or public speaking engagements. What surprised nearly everyone was Prince Harry's public response. For the first time in years, he openly defended his brother without qualification or caveat. In a statement given to People magazine, Harry said simply that William was right and that the press had learned nothing since their mother's time. It was a brief comment, just a few sentences, but it carried enormous weight given the very public rift between the brothers that had dominated royal coverage for years. The statement suggested that despite their differences and the choices that had driven them apart, they remained connected by their shared childhood trauma and their mutual understanding of what it meant to grow up under relentless media scrutiny. Inside Windsor Castle, the institutional consequences of William's decision were becoming clear. Senior courtiers were frustrated and concerned, with some openly criticising what they saw as an emotional rather than strategic approach to crisis management. One palace insider reportedly complained that survival within the royal institution required discretion and careful management, not raw honesty. The comment reflected a fundamental tension between the traditional approach to royal life, which emphasized dignity through silence, and the more modern expectation of authenticity and emotional transparency that William represented. Princess Anne, however, offered a different perspective. She visited Windsor the evening after the statement and found William in a private sitting room, still processing the day's events and the avalanche of public response. Anne told him directly that he had done what their mother would have wanted, that he had reminded the world that royals were human beings first, members of an institution second. Coming from Anne, who had spent decades serving the crown with unwavering dedication and minimal public complaint, the endorsement meant something significant. Public opinion polls conducted in the days following the statement showed overwhelming support for William's decision. More than 80% of respondents in Britain expressed approval of his statement, with many calling it the most authentic moment from a royal family member since Princess Diana's famous television interview in the 1990s. Even in the United States, where interest in the British monarchy had been waning in recent years, viewership of royal-related news coverage surged dramatically. The New York Times published an editorial titled "The Heir Who Became a Father First," examining how William's choice to prioritize his children over institutional expectations might represent a new model of leadership for the modern age. Catherine watched much of the coverage from Adelaide Cottage, tears streaming down her face as she saw the outpouring of support for her husband and sympathy for her sons. She later told Princess Anne quietly that William had found his voice in standing up for their family, and somehow in doing so, he had given her back her own strength as well. It was an acknowledgement of how much the entire family had been struggling under the weight of expectation and scrutiny, and how William's decision to speak openly had created space for all of them to breathe. That evening, the Wales family gathered privately with no cameras, no palace staff hovering. Nearby, no official duties to fulfill. William, Catherine, George, Louis and Princess Charlotte sat together in their sitting room with a fire burning in the hearth. The outside world continued its noisy debate about what William's statement meant for the monarchy and for royal protocol. But inside that room, there was only quiet conversation and relief. Prince Louis, who had been withdrawn and anxious for so long, leaned his head against his father's shoulder and asked in his small voice whether Daddy had fixed everything. William smiled faintly and answered honestly that he hadn't fixed everything. Not yet, but he thought they were beginning to heal. Outside Windsor's ancient walls, the media storm continued to rage, with analysts and commentators offering endless interpretations of what had happened and what it might mean for the future. But inside, for the first time in months, there was genuine peace. The weight hadn't disappeared entirely. The pressures of royal life would never fully vanish. But something fundamental had shifted. William had chosen his family over tradition, honesty over image. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching that beneath the titles and the ceremony and the centuries of history, there were real people trying to love and protect each other. The monarchy's carefully constructed image had certainly taken a blow. Royal watchers debated whether William's emotional transparency had damaged the institution's authority or updated it for contemporary audiences. But something else had begun to happen as well. Something quieter but potentially more lasting. A family that had been fracturing under impossible pressure was starting to knit itself back together, finding strength not in silence, but in the courage to admit they were struggling and needed support. And perhaps in the end, that honest vulnerability represented a more powerful form of leadership than any amount of stoic dignity could have provided.